Hey
Good
everyone.
afternoon.
Hello. Thanks for
Sean,
joining
put
us.
Shawnee, put your gavel away. We are 2 minutes, a minute and a half early,
Yep.
so you
Yep.
can
Sean,
you can just sit back and relax.
that's right. You've got nowhere to go, Sean. Nowhere to go. Well, welcome you guys to another episode of Forensic Intent, and thanks a lot for joining us. Scott here, in case you're new, and my co-host Rachel, Dr. Rachel. So today we are going to talk with a highly touted criminal defense attorney who is based in Minnesota. His name's Jack Rice. And we're going to do a little bit bio here on Jack, a little bit of background on him. Jack is a nationally recognized and award-winning criminal defense lawyer. He's been awarded as the best criminal defense lawyers of 2024. He's a board-certified criminal law specialist. Jack's also a former prosecutor, and he's a former U.S. Central Intelligence Agency CIA officer.
It's pretty cool. He is a defense lawyer that has decades of experience successfully representing thousands of clients facing everything from sex crimes, child pornography, domestic assault, to DWI, to murder, to other serious criminal charges. And you probably know him pretty well from appearing on Court TV, CNN, MSNBC, BBC, Fox, and more. He's all over the place, guys. Please welcome Jack Rice.
There he is. Jack, good to see you. Thanks for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great to be
Yeah.
with you.
Thanks so much. So before we jump into our case, because we want to kind of discuss the Karen Read case a little bit today, Jack, and I know you're aware of that, but I just kind of like to talk to you and have you kind of chat a little bit with our audience about your background, about you were a prosecutor, you were in the CIA, you're now a criminal defense attorney, and kind of your role up as we get to the present, present.
Sure. I've been a criminal defense attorney for decades. And that other experience certainly colors what I do because I'm dealing with this all of the time. So I've been working on these issues for more than 30 years when you look back, which frankly shocks me sometimes that I realize that is the case, but I think that's the nature of the game. But when we think about this, I mean, one of the things in the very biggest sense, and it's this, is that if you think about the criminal justice system and you think about the legal system as a whole, one of the things that I can tell you is it is one of the few things that actually binds us together as a society. And it really does. And what I mean by that is this, is that what happens if there are large swaths of a society who don't buy in, if they don't believe that the system works, you're going to see disintegration inside of that society. Frankly, you can look at the 2016 election, really the 2020 election, and I don't care which side you're on. When you start seeing large swaths of the society starting to question the validity of it, what you're starting to see is that disintegration. And I can say this because I've taught trial advocacy skills, legal skills to lawyers in Republic of Georgia, Istanbul, let's see, Thailand, Russia, South Sudan, Kenya, Tanzania, all over the world. And one of the reasons that I do that is because that binding concept is something that they've had to deal with too. And so as a result, you buy in, you find that stability sort of follows. You don't buy in, you see that disintegration. And so when I watch what is happening even inside the United States, you can think about this questioning of authority, questioning of whether the system actually works or not. And frankly, that dovetails pretty nicely into the Karen Read case, because if we think about why so many people are doubting the government in this case, I think a big part of it has to not just do with conspiracy. It's actually the questioning, the foundational questioning of whether a system can actually be fair and whether an individual is actually being played, if you will. And I think that goes back, but it certainly goes forward in terms of how people see that case, and frankly, several other cases, lots of other cases around the country.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Rachel. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think that my biggest question in all of this is why this case over many of the other ones we see. You know, there's, of course, when, you know, the defense cross-examines and law enforcement, you know, they try to discredit the investigation. They try to, you know, put some doubt in the jurors' minds about are these people, are they corrupt? Did they do things right? But this is like obviously a completely different level of, like you said, conspiracy, and the way the public is reacting. I can't, you don't usually see this much going on outside the courthouse. The shouting, the screaming. So what is it about this case in particular that is creating all of this?
It's a wonderful question, and I wish I had the crystal ball to really look at why so many have grabbed on and gravitated to it. That's not to say that there aren't those who are looking at particular issues that are really grabbing them, but I would argue to some degree there is this underlying question about the authenticity of what the government is actually doing. And here's what I mean, is I've seen this over the last 25 and 30 years, is that there was a time when a police officer took the stand. People would believe whatever they said, whenever they said it, however they said it. And I mean it. It was almost blind faith. Mm-hmm. And from a prosecution standpoint, it made it quite easy because these are professional witnesses. They're trained to do this. And you can tell this way. You ask them a question and you understand this, Scott. You take a deep breath, and what do? You turn, pivot, look straight at the jury and say, let me tell you the truth.
That's right.
You may not say that, but that's what you mean. You pivot, look at them, and you go, boom, here's the answer. What we have seen in the last 5+ years is something fundamentally different. Across the country, where there is a lot of people on a lot of different sides for all kinds of political reasons, whether those are people of color who have looked at this situation and said, you have ignored us, denied us, abused us for 400 years. And we have one thing now that we didn't have before, this. Mm-hmm. We had this. And that is huge. And yet at the same time, you have people maybe in the same political realm, political spectrum, but maybe on the opposite side of that spectrum, who are actually looking at, I hate to go back to the 2020 election, but as an example, not just the reason, but those who may look at this and say, the system is broken. There's something about this that's just wrong. Now, if we look specifically at Reed, there's one piece that grabs me that I find really interesting, and it's this. It's the injuries to John O'Keefe. That's the piece that is grabbing me. And
me too.
Is because forensics, and this is what I would say in front of a jury, people lie. Forensics doesn't. Right. People lie all the time. They're motivated by greed. They're motivated by sex. They're motivated by power. They're motivated by all sorts of things. But forensics, on the other hand, injuries frequently speak for themselves. And when you have inconsistencies that feel, for lack of a better word, scientific, when they feel scientific and those don't match up with the words of people around them who may have motives of their own, that is an extraordinary piece of evidence that juries will wrap around themselves like a coat. And they will hold on to that in such a way that you can't dislodge it from them. Mm-hmm. If I were the prosecutors in this case, I would be concerned because there are a lot of people and a lot of rumblings out there that say, I'm questioning the validity of the Boston Police Department, the authenticity of that department, the willingness of them to actually not, quote unquote, protect their own and go after those who they don't see as their own, and this forensics piece. Plus a few other things, some timeline issues, some weird discoveries subsequently that feel like you're just sort of spicing up that soup a little bit too much for my liking. So there's a bunch in there that make me question it, Rachel.
So if this was not a police officer, or even if it was a police officer, but the people inside of that house were not law enforcement, would this be a completely different case that we're looking at right here?
1,000% different.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally different when you have that. There is still this belief, and maybe this is my opinion, not others, but what I can say is that there's a lot of people who are questioning sort of the authority wherever you are in that sort of spectrum. But there are a lot of people who desperately want it to be true.
Hmm.
They do. They want to believe officers. They want to believe that the system works because they built their lives upon that concept. I get that.
Yeah.
And it matters. And so when you're standing in front of a jury, you don't stand in front of the jury you want. You stand in front of the jury you get. And you stand in front of the jury that comes with a lot of preconceived notions. Because let's be clear, every jury, and I repeat, every jury is biased. Every jury walks into that room with a myopic, tunnel vision approach to how the world should work. And so you need to accept that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone has a lens.
Yes,
They
yes,
view everything through, and that's their lens. Yeah.
Most definitely. You know, Jack, in talking about the injuries, that's been the biggest piece with me too. And Rachel and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, you know, you've got one side saying that, okay, he was hit by a car, Karen backed into him and possibly backed over him. And the injuries to his arm, you know, one side saying, okay, that's caused by blunt force trauma. The other side is saying it's probably caused by the German Shepherd that was in the house. There's just so many back and forth things on this case. And, you know, it's really hard to know what to believe, quite frankly. I mean, it really is. So if it's a mess of a case, Jack, so how do you defend something like this? If you were to have to defend this case, what would be some of the things you would do?
Well, I think about the idea of what the burden is in the first place, and I sort of work my way backward. Yeah. So proof beyond a reasonable doubt, it's the highest standard in American jurisprudence. And you think about what those standards are, and you could work your way through them, right? I mean, if you think about it like this, and this is, I said this to a jury last week, is that you think about a very low standard called articulable suspicion. This basically means this is why an officer can stop somebody. They don't have to think a crime was committed. It just has to be unusual and not much more than that. There's certain things you can't do, but the standard is very, very low. After that, you need enough to arrest probable cause. Then what you would need is preponderance of the evidence. It's actually a civil standard. And that's kind of like 5,000 on one side and 5,001 on the other. That's a standard. Then you would have something called clear and convincing. That's actually also above that. And that one is also a civil standard. And frequently, some people put that at that 75, 80%. But then you have this other standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. What that means is if you have any doubt at all, a singular doubt, and it is reasonable, something that you can hook it around and say, in my head, this has not been answered and this hasn't been explained. Now, let's think about what those possible questions that may not be able to be answered by the state are. Let's talk about that dog question. The German Shepherd that may be in the house, that maybe got outside, that maybe somehow found its way over to a frozen body. Is that what we're saying? There's a whole lot of maybes there. And if I got a whole lot of maybes, what I'm doing as a defense attorney is I'm finding seams and I'm shoving something in those seams and I'm pushing them open and I'm driving them open. And I'm going to ask and I'm going to demand that the state fulfill their obligations to the people because they claim that they represent the people. Fine, let's let them. Let's make sure we hold them to that. And so that's your starting point. And then you dig into every question that's there. Yeah. And you force an answer out of them. And if they don't give you one and say, well, I mean, we think it's this. You think? You're trying to tell me you want to convict somebody of a crime because you think. Now, all of a sudden, you're starting to gain some traction.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Creating that reasonable doubt is so important. No question.
Well, if I might, but it's actually more than that, because I would argue that there is another approach to this, which I think is also important. Rather than saying you can't prove your case, I think there is a human nature aspect to this, because what juries hate to do is they don't like guilty people walking. Right. They don't. And so as a result, what you also want to give them, not that you have to, but what you want to give them is an alternative. And that's exactly what we're seeing in these. What you're seeing is a whole bunch of people coming in saying, hold on, that's not what happened in this case.
Yeah.
That's not what happened in
Yeah.
this case. It went down like this. And that's really important because
Mhm.
a jury is desperately trying to find answers in a very small world. Remember, that world is just what they see in those four walls of that courtroom.
Mhm.
You got to try to get that in there or try to keep it out, either way, depending
Yeah.
on who you are.
Yeah.
And that's what the defense team is really trying to do: exclude certain pieces and bring in everything they can. The judge is doing admirable work, but let me tell you what, that judge has got their hands full. This is quite a team who's keeping everybody on their toes. That's for darn sure.
Absolutely.
Well, and it's such a monumental task. I mean, and Rachel and I've talked about this too, to get everyone, assuming let's go with the cover-up theory, okay?
Mhm.
It's a huge task, Jack, to get everybody on the same page with that. I mean, what would you say about that? I mean, you've got the DA's office, you've multiple police agencies. I mean, there's a lot to do. So what do you think about that?
From a prosecution.
Well, yeah. Yeah, whichever
Okay.
side.
Yeah,
You both,
whatever you're comfortable with.
I used to work for the Central Intelligence Agency.
Mhm.
And I always thought to myself, JFK, right? Everybody's thinking, ooh. But the thing is, over time, I have come to a weird realization in general, is that I'm less confident in conspiracy than I am in incompetency.
Okay.
And
That
normally,
makes sense.
to line everybody up, in a room and say, okay, we're going to get not just the people who are in that house, but now you're talking about the Bureau, you're talking about the Boston Police Department, you're talking about several other people who came and went, and that somehow they all collectively came up with this master plan, and this is how it's going to play out. That takes a level of confidence, which I think I doubt. And I think the problem you're going to see is this is going to be a huge fight about competency and sort of a belief in whether or not the person who takes the stand is simply honest, simply the kind of person with enough character that they would simply tell what they know. And so this issue of whether or not you buy into what each of these witnesses say is going to be an individual fight, meaning each one who takes the stand, watch the defense swing at them. And they're going to have to swing hard, because if they miss and they drop on just one or two, the conspiracy starts to get on very shaky ground. Because if one you believe is telling the truth, well, then how do the others hold up? But this one somehow is the honest one, unless that one's the dupe. Well, what about if there's two of them? You see what I mean? So that's going to be a challenge, because they gotta take everybody down, not just one or two of those people.
Yeah. You're gonna, for there to be this conspiracy theory proven, or at least causing reasonable doubt, they will have to all have the exact same story about everything. Because isn't that how it would have had to line up in the investigation, right? I mean,
well, I've seen this happen before, though. People will see different things. I've been in enough crime scenes, and I've certainly been in enough trials where I will see 2 and 3 people who are in a room when somebody dies, and they will see different things. We all assume when we sit in a room, we all see the same things. We don't.
Right.
I mean, we look at what we look at.
Right. And they can all be true.
Right.
So I guess the question, though, is, can those different things people are talking about occur simultaneously?
Correct.
Or are there conflicts, right?
Perfect. And if I'm prosecuting, that's exactly my point, is that nothing has to line up perfectly, completely, because you can see one thing, not see another. And that doesn't mean that they're not running concurrently. right?
Right.
Side by side. If I'm watching nothing but a television show and someone's in the kitchen cooking, or I'm the one in the kitchen cooking and somebody else is watching it, that doesn't mean they weren't both happening at the same time. It just means I was looking one way, they were looking another.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that from the perspective of a prosecutor trying to convince a jury that they don't all have to be perfect. It doesn't all have to line up. It has to be logical, make sense, collectively work, and be consistent, not
Right.
perfect.
Right.
Very interesting.
How does a court manage what's going to be happening outside of the courthouse? So you have these jurors that are going to be coming and going. Is there a secret tunnel? I mean, what are they going to do about this? That's what I want to know.
It's a great question. I mean, remember, I'm in St. Paul right now. I was living about 8 blocks from where George Floyd was murdered.
Okay.
And I watched that trial up close and personal, like everybody else in the world, ultimately. And to watch how that judge tried to control this jury was certainly educational. And I watched this with a lot of other trials around the country. And in this particular case, one of the questions that's frequently asked by a judge early on when you put a potential jury in, and as I recall, I think they're going to have 12 jurors plus, is it 5 or 7 alternates, something like that? It's more,
Yeah.
usually what I see is 12 plus 2, 12 plus 3.
It's 4, I believe. 12
think-
plus 4, I think.
Right. So,
Yeah.
and the idea, just so if people don't understand what you're going to get, is felonies generally, what you're seeing is a jury of 12 that has to come in and unanimously agree that somebody is guilty of the crime that they committed in most jurisdictions. And in this case, what they frequently will do is through the jury process itself, you will have alternates. And those are maybe 13, 14, 15, 16, or however many they end up having. What happens is they're there to watch all of the evidence. But if somebody drops out, if somebody doesn't show up, somebody gets sick, somebody gets bounced for some reason or another, then they can take one of those alternates and put them into that slot because they were there for the entire process. If they didn't do that, what would happen is ultimately they would have to start that entire trial over again. That's the reason you have the alternates. But one of the first questions you ask of all of these potential jurors and the alternates too, and anybody else who's in that jury pool, is the question of, have you heard anything about this case? Well, the answer is, who hasn't?
Right.
Who hasn't
Right.
heard about Karen Reed?
Right.
Who hasn't heard about John O'Keefe? And by the way, who is the knucklehead living under a rock? Who hasn't? And I might be more afraid of that person than I am of the ones who have. And so as a result, one of those questions becomes, can you set aside everything that you have heard, quote unquote, that you know, right? And can you set that aside so you can actually fairly accept, listen to the evidence, weigh it, see if you can apply the standards that the judge is requiring of you, and come to a conclusion, come to a decision as to guilt or whether or not the state's failed in their burden. And that's where they've been spending so much time focusing is, can you set aside everything you're hearing? But this case is so much different because of all this weird little stuff. It's like,
Right.
well, wait a second, there's that broken tail light. And then they found some extra pieces of plastic. And then they found even more pieces of plastic.
Mhm.
Hold on a second. You mean you didn't find them in the first place because that was such a thorough investigation? That was so incredibly impressive that you didn't find them. Instead, you waited. Did you wait an hour? Oh, no. This is much, much longer.
Right.
Is it not, it's the next month, is it not, when they find some of them?
Right.
I
They
think
find
so.
some, and then
They
they go
blame it
back
on
and they
snow.
find more, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, as a defense attorney, my response is, okay, I got incompetent cops now. This is very Keystone-ish in a sense, because you're like, is anybody actually doing an investigation? And if they
Mhm.
are, is it any good?
Mhm.
So now you get to weigh the value of what it is the state is actually bringing. And that may be useful. It all depends upon the theory of your case. and they clearly have one now, or a theme of how you go after the opposing side. And trust me, the prosecutors are doing the exact same thing with the defense, basically arguing these are Hail Mary after Hail Mary after Hail Mary. It's all conspiracy. It's all conspiracy, right?
Right.
That's what they're arguing, and that's why we're all watching.
Yeah. It's, what you were just talking about with the tail light and the investigation in general, Jack. I mean, that's very, very helpful, in my opinion, to the defense, because, as a former officer, we're taught, when you do an investigation, you get the evidence right away. You get it the first time, you get everything.
Scott,
as
why
effectively
is
as
that?
possible.
Why is it, Scott, as a former officer yourself, why is it that you get it right the first time?
So that they can't come back and say that you botched the investigation, essentially.
And if you botch the investigation, meaning in terms of collection of evidence, what does that say about the broader investigation in your mind?
That, if you've botched that and if you've messed that up, what else are you messing up as well?
Yeah. By the way, burden of proof,
Yeah.
proof beyond a reasonable doubt, a reasonable doubt. If I can't trust the quality of the investigation itself, just because the officers say something doesn't mean it's true or completely true. Or should we all go back out on that street today and see what else we can find together? Because maybe we should just take a little trip. We'll take all 12 of those jurors out in a bus and we can all look together. Why don't we do that? Won't that be fun? I don't know. I'm kind of liking my closing. It's already starting to come together, don't you think?
I think so. I think
so. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So, Jack, you just brought up something that I want to just ask you about regarding, it can be Karen Read or any case that you.
Sure.
So, opening arguments, extremely important. Not evidence, obviously, but extremely important. So, talk about the importance, if you could, about the opening argument and how it works with the jury.
Sure. There's a huge difference between openings and closings. And in fact, if you look at what they're actually officially called, you realize there is a difference. Openings are called opening statements. Closings are called closing arguments.
Yes.
And so that kind of tells you what it means. And you're limited in many ways. What an opening is about telling the jury what's coming. What evidence is going to be introduced.
Mm-hmm.
What you don't get to say is you don't get to say what it means. You don't get to jump to those conclusions about what this evidence means.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, there are some aspects of openings that are absolutely critical. Now, one example of that is this. You talk about what's called a theme. And what I mean by a theme is this idea that this case is about.
Sorry, guys, technical difficulties here.
No worries. Shall I stop or shall we keep
Sorry,
going?
yeah, you guys, we all.
Oops, I'm not sure what happened there. I think Rachel froze up. Can you hear me, Jack?
I can hear you. Rachel,
You can hear me?
Okay, there
Scott
we
and I
go.
keep going in and out. I don't know what's happening right now.
I'm not sure either. Anyway, go ahead, Jack. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, no worries. So the idea of a theme is basically, what is this case actually about? And the idea is to be able to think about a concept that says that this thing happened. And if you think about the state's case, and I haven't really come up with a theme in terms of what they're doing, but what they're essentially arguing was this is a relationship that's had
I'm
its
so
day.
sorry. I don't know what's going on, you guys.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
What's happening on your end, Rachel?
Nothing. I have
Okay.
full internet. I don't know what's going on.
Well, I can see everybody and everybody's
Yeah.
moving on my end.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're all good. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, go ahead, Jack. Sorry.
Sorry, you
No
guys.
problem. No problem. And I think from a state's perspective, what we see is that this is a relationship that's had its day. If you look at what happened, it starts with a fight in Aruba. It ends at the end of this relationship where this gets worse and worse and worse. And what you're going to see is the buildup of this relationship. And some relationships can go well, they have their day, and when they're over, they're done. And that when that happens, then you're going to start seeing a different kind of behavior. And then what they'll do is they're going to start showing that timeline, talking about being in that bar, talking about the witnesses that saw this, talking about the car, her car that was actually there, and what it is those witnesses saw, and how it all fits together. And there's no other way to explain this. But that's what really openings are designed to do. But sometimes from a defense perspective, you can introduce a theme that is so much better, that is so much more, that basically opens up an entire series of questions that requires the state to respond to them all. And what you get is a pivot, a required pivot by the state to try to come back and go on the defensive, because they have to. And so when you get really good at this, you lay this out in such a way that it grabs the jury. I mean, I think of it like this, and this certainly goes to closings, but it happens in openings too, is that I truly believe that people, and I mean all people, educated, less educated, no formal education, a lot of life education, everybody in between, maybe overeducated, it's everybody in between, that people make decisions viscerally. They decide what the answer is. I believe this. And that then what they do is they intellectualize it. They then turn around and say, okay, why am I right? And then if you asked them, and that could happen very quickly, by the way, I think if you then asked them how they decided this, they would tell you the intellectual reasons first. But I think what frequently happens is people go, I just, something about it, right? They can't, if you point to it, they just go, yeah, it just smells wrong. There's something about it that just doesn't work. And some things just need to work. And so what you're going to do is you're driving at that space. And that's a critical piece. But openings are always designed to say, here's what's coming. And this is what this evidence is going to be introduced. This person's going to take the stand. These people are going to do this. But it's also important to, and I don't know how else to say this, you have to tell a narrative. You have to be able to tell a story, because it all comes back to the gut. It all comes back to saying, I just know there's something wrong, or there's something dirty about her, or there's something wrong about them, or she's just being honest and people are playing her. You can tell she's a scapegoat. Whatever you want to do, you're going to play that. And I think jurors can get sucked down that proverbial emotional hole with you. And sometimes you're inviting it. It's like, come on, I'm going to tell you, come with me. We can do this together. And that's what you do.
This is a good, you brought up something good, the likability or the way that they perceive the defendant, right? So I told Scott this all the time. There are certain times where defendants are, it's like you can kind of see how they got themselves in this situation, even if they're not guilty, right? Like, even though you probably didn't do this, you sort of fit the type of person I think might do this, right? Like weird reactions they have right after the crime takes place. What comes to my mind is like Amanda Knox, God bless her. Like, she's kind of eccentric, she's an eccentric, artsy kind of girl, like young, immature at the time, just sort of like, she acted a little weird, but I think that's kind of how she is as a person. But doesn't mean she's a murderer, right? But so when you have a defendant, the way that, this is my personal opinion, the way that I perceive Karen Read and the very little that I've seen her.
Come on, Rachel, tell me what you think.
Obviously, I also know in context that this has all been in very stressful situations, but she's from the Northeast. She's kind of abrupt. She's kind of blunt. She's sort of crass. She's got the accent. She's a strong-willed woman. We've heard the voicemail of her calling him John an effing loser. So this is all in context, of course, but when the public sees that, I think it's easy to say, oh my gosh, yeah, she could have totally done this, right? And while the jury may not, well, they're probably going to hear the voicemail, but while the jury may not interact with her much or see her in the news, they're still going to get a sense of who she is and how she acts, right?
Well, let's face it. I mean, as we were talking about earlier, bias exists.
Yeah.
How we see people exists, but let's think of it this way. If you're in different parts of the country, we behave differently.
Yes.
Generally, it's a general statement, right? And what's going to happen is that the jury that's going to decide this case is essentially from not just the Northeast, but essentially the Boston area.
Yeah.
And as a result, you're going to see more people who will be maybe more comfortable with
That's
that
true.
language, more comfortable with the accent. I mean, it's an interesting
True.
thing because I can take you in the South, and when somebody says, "Oh, bless your heart," let me tell you, do you know what that means? So here's an example.
Mhm.
My daughter, forever ago, right? My daughter in can I curse in this or not?
Sure.
Sure.
Go for it. Yeah.
Okay. My daughter used to work for Disney, and many years ago. And when she worked at Disney, sometimes if you had a character, and that's what they called everybody who worked there.
Yes.
If you did something that really irritated a Disney employee, this is what they would say. They would say, "Have a magical day." Now, and I said, "Well, sweetheart, what does have a magical day actually mean in Disney parlance? And how do I say this nicely?"
Go F yourself.
There's no way to say it nicely. It means go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Man, I can't wait to go to Disney next time.
There we go.
I'm sure. Why, Rachel? Have you heard this before? Does this sound familiar to you?
Not directly to me, I don't think.
I'm not judging you. But my point is that all of a sudden, what you find is that depending upon where you are in the country, how you see or perceive something changes dramatically. And I think that's one of the reasons that people will be driven differently. They will say things or hear things, and you'll see a more abrupt style of language potentially. And I listen to it so much, partially because words matter, and words matter to what I do for a living so much that I study them, I watch them. I've had clients treated differently because of how they speak, the rapidity, how fast they speak, the accents they have, if they're a foreign national, if their skin is a slightly different tint, if their hair looks different, if they look somehow strange. If you look weird, you're more likely to go down as a sex offender than if you look like me.
Yep.
You just are.
Yep.
Not saying it can't happen, but I'm saying that juries will look at all sorts of things and jump to really interesting conclusions as to why they conclude the way they do. There's that visceral piece. She just seemed nice. I mean, could a nice person do something like that?
Exactly.
It's so horrific. And I find that fascinating. So to your language piece, to her colorful use of language, Boston, other parts of the country, they may be like, meh. I mean, I'd say maybe, or maybe not. I don't know.
So sometimes maybe, thank goodness, a jury of your peers, right? Because culturally, geographically, and culturally, that can be,
well, that's
can
true,
make things a non-issue.
But what I can tell you, and I think that's an interesting sort of piece, only this is maybe an aside, is that this idea of a jury of your peers, I've had cases, murder cases, other kinds of cases, where my client was the only person of color in the entire room. The entire jury was white.
Yeah.
And the only person in the room was a person of color. And they're looking at me like, where's the jury of my peers?
Yeah. Fair question.
What I can tell you is the law says that jury of your peers doesn't mean they have to look like you.
Right.
And so there are times when the system may feel unfair. And frankly, there are times when the system has been unfair. You look at the Innocence Project that objectively has proven that there have been hundreds and hundreds of people who were incorrectly found guilty. And I think you can just about guarantee that there have been multiple people who have been put to death who simply could not have done this. And it's not that they were proven, it's actually that they were innocent, literally innocent.
Literally.
Right.
And that is a pretty scary space to be, but that's the system we have. And that's part of what makes it so scary. And by the way, one last point, I can tell you, nothing petrifies a defense attorney more than having an innocent client. Because the prosecutors think they did it. You're generally not going to bring somebody unless you think they did it.
Right.
But the problem is you might be wrong. But what happens if the defense attorney's like, no, I believe it. And now all of a sudden you feel like you're fighting for their lives because you are. And that is petrifying.
I can imagine. You can see it in some of the
Sure.
attorneys' faces when guilty verdicts come down, and you can sometimes I feel like you can tell what they really think,
Mhm.
just heartbreaking.
I've wept at the end of trials.
I bet. I would. I have
bet.
too, and I have nothing to do with them. So
I
I totally get it.
Part of what happens with this, I can tell you as a prosecutor, here's an interesting sort of thing that I've noticed. As a prosecutor, one of the benefits that you have, and I think about you, Scott, is having your expertise, putting you on the stand. I get these really talented, dedicated, intelligent, experienced, highly trained individuals who can walk in and talk about the investigation that they did. And what I do is it becomes a bit of a three-ring circus. My job is to simply lay it out, and I just I put these people on the stand. And what I do is I stand on the shoulders of giants.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is as a defense attorney, frequently think of it like an upside down pyramid. And what happens is the entire pyramid is balanced on the top of my head. I have to put everything out. I have to put every person, none of whom wants to be there. Every one of them is petrified. The ramifications are catastrophic. None of them are experts. And frequently they have nowhere near the resources that the government has, which is almost unlimited sometimes. And we're the ones who have to say, he didn't do it, believe us.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be really, really challenging.
Oh, yes, it can, most definitely.
Yeah.
So, Jack, what else do you want to discuss here before we wrap it up?
Well, I was thinking, I'm sitting here almost laughing, Scott, I don't know why, but we were talking about, sort of the demographic and jury peers, and we were discussing how, Karen Reed is a white, attractive woman, which that is what we had some debate about between me and Scott. Is she actually attractive or not? I kid.
I'm going to leave that to the both of you.
Yeah, I won't get into the details of that discussion, but maybe for another Get to Know Scott and Rachel show.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I like to school Scott on various slang, and so that's fun sometimes. But
pull you into the 21st century. Come on.
trying. So, and Scott and I have both seen cases where young, attractive, Caucasian individuals, that seem to be pretty charming, like moms. There's no way they could have done this. Look at them. That's not a person that does this. Behavior in the courtroom is stellar, and off they go, and they did what they did, So I think that does play. I think that will play into this, and there's sort of like this celebrity-ness to her now, with the public being so divided, and people are chanting her name coming up to the courthouse, and I think that fuels the polarized community too.
I think those are reasonable conclusions. Because again, this falls back on that visceral nature of how we decide the things that we do. And I think sometimes this idea that somebody who we've decided is like us, somebody who we've decided has been wronged, somebody who is attractive, somebody who we look up to potentially, we give them more slack. We give them more space. We give them more grace.
Right.
And when it comes down to this idea, when you're asking this question, well, they seem so nice. Mm-hmm. How could somebody do that? And you
can't picture it.
It's hard to picture that. Yeah. Whereas when you have somebody sit down and say, and the first thought these jurors have was, well, I wonder what he did.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we have these presumptions. We say there's a presumption of innocence. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
Well, we want things to fall into categories that match what we're seeing in our lens. Like we want the nasty, unattractive, creepy looking people to have done the bad things in this category, the non-parents, we want all of them to go in that category because it makes sense. It's like it matches up. So
Yeah.
like, especially if in your life you can't connect that to anything where somebody's not what you think they are, or, it's very hard, I think, for people to do.
I wonder sometimes if this goes back to primordial times where we look at people who we find beautiful, and that somehow we think that those are good people, and people who we find unattractive are somehow like there's something about them. I don't know if this is how we procreate, and so therefore this person is
Yeah.
healthier, and so therefore we jump to conclusions that they're better in some way.
Primal thing that kicks in that we
I don't know. But
I don't either. Yeah.
maybe there is actually something to that, where you just see this and say primordially, is that right?
Sure.
Let's go with it, right?
Let's do it.
That because of that, these are better people. These are somehow better people. And better people don't do these things. Well, you've just created another burden that the government has to overcome.
Mhm.
And maybe they have enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, except for people in their guts will say, yeah, but I still have it because Johnny Depp, he's just a bad boy. You know what I mean? He's just a bad boy. Hey, something about that. Come on, Jack Sparrow. I don't know
Yeah. I don't know.
what it is, and I think sometimes Amber Heard got torn to pieces for lots of reasons, but for whatever reason, we decide we're going one path or another. And sometimes it's just what we do.
Yeah. There's a really good question, actually sort of a question that Sean was wondering, saying, wondering what her attorneys are telling her about how to interact with her supporters. Like on the way into the courthouse, how do you advise a client when this is what's going on around them?
Yeah. It's actually useful in a case like this, because what you want is the more they connect, I would argue, the more that her supporters will see themselves in her face, the more that outrage will continue, and they will continue to dig to show why, free Karen Read. This chant continues. And why is it that was the case? And yet we come to another conclusion. I can't believe I forgot her name. The young woman who was found not guilty in Florida of killing her baby.
Casey Anthony?
Yes.
Anthony. Why is it that Casey Anthony, on the other side of this, what happened was they turned her into a monster in the one sense, but frankly, they used her attorney used during closings the S word for what they described her as. And they called her a really terrible thing, because I think that what he said was, for 6 weeks, the prosecution called Casey Anthony this word. And frankly, they did. And yet, because she's at this party and she's dressing like this and she has this boyfriend and then she has that boyfriend, etc., which, by the way, has nothing to do with whether or not she killed her kid.
Right.
But they did it. And the question is, why? Why would you do that? Well, you would do that because you're going to create an atmosphere of detest for somebody like that. I would argue that's why they did it.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
What does that have to do with whether she killed her? But they did. And I think what happened was that realization, which their attorney, who was magnificent, by the way, he is magnificent. What he did was he then turned it around and he said to the jury, don't let them play you like that. Because that's what they did. And that's why they did it. And the thing is I think that jury heard that and went, damn, that's what they did. See? There's something to this. This is such a
weak jury.
It's human nature. It's what we do. We look at the world and we want the world to make sense to us. And so we come to lots of conclusions, and we force some of those because we want to be able to make sense of how the world works. Don't we? I do. I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Jack, I want to jump aside for just a second. I I know one of the things that I really will step away from this case. One of the things that I really admire about you is the fact that you have gone overseas. I know you've gone over to Tanzania, to Kenya, I think to Uganda, one of
Uganda.
those places. Uganda, there we go.
All of South Sudan during the wars.
Okay, and you train attorneys, work with attorneys over there. So what are this is a very broad question. You can answer it however you want to, whichever direction you want to go. What are some of the foundational differences for lawyers over in those countries versus lawyers here in the United States that you've encountered? Does that make sense?
No, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things that's really interesting to me and surprises me, and I think it shouldn't, but it did, is that we come from the British tradition. And we don't think about that. You know, we severed ourselves from them 250 years ago, but we come from the British tradition. And so what you have is this British tradition that goes worldwide. And you think about the Commonwealth, you think about Kenya, you think about Tanzania, you think about Australia, you think about Nigeria, et cetera, et cetera. And what you find is that that system works in many ways just like our own. Now, you'll hear references to my lord, and I know some judges here who would love to be called that regularly because that's how. And some of them don't use juries, and there are times when you start to wonder whether or not juries are actually any good. You look at some of the statistics behind them, and you get somewhat surprised by that. So one of the things that I have found is that I have worked with really extraordinary lawyers who frankly taught me far more than I ever taught them in other parts of the world. And what I can tell you is because the system is similar, our worldly approaches are equally similar. So it's kind of like we've learned through a certain system, so we work a certain way. And I recall one criminal defense attorney, we were about the same age, about the same experience. I was in northern Uganda, and his background was crazy. It was amazing. It was amazing, his background. He was astounding, an amazing lawyer. But because of what we did, and we did it so long together in this individually by 7,000 miles, right? That we looked at the world very similarly. And so sometimes we work within a system and we think that somehow the system is just a backdrop, but the system itself actually impacts how we do what we do, but also who we are within that system. And so I'm regularly surprised that this guy and I, we were like brothers. We were the same. And I remember thinking, this is crazy.
Yeah.
And there it was. And at the same time, I was working in the Ural Mountains in central Russia, and in a closed city called Izhevsk. And it had actually been a city, it was known as the armorer of the Tsars, and then the armory of the Soviet Union. It was a city that was on no maps. And I was working in this city, and this was where the AK-47 was developed, by the way. And there's even a museum for the AK-47 in this place. Tchaikovsky is from this region in the Urals. And it's a completely different system. The lawyers are completely 100% different in terms of how they see the world. They're really different. And you think that it's the government or sort of something else. I think the system itself tweaks you and manipulates you and changes you and molds you and swaddles you in a different way, and it makes you something else. And that's an example of what I've seen worldwide.
Yeah. Very interesting. That must be very fulfilling, though, to be able to go over and do that kind of work, Jack. I think that would be a wonderful experience and very, very fulfilling to do.
Well, I appreciate it. I do. I'm extraordinarily lucky. I don't come with a pedigree. I don't have this long history And so this was somehow what was expected of me. I grew up in a trailer park.
Hmm.
And so I look back at it and scratch my head regularly and think to myself, why me? How me? And even to this day, I'm still asking myself those questions, and I'm going to keep fooling people until they catch on.
Well, you clearly have a gift.
Yeah,
You clearly
absolutely.
have a gift.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We appreciate you coming on so much, Jack. Thank you so
Definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Very
Are we
kind.
gonna see you on Court TV on Monday?
You're going to see me. Let's see. You're going to see me on Court TV tomorrow.
much.
Okay.
So tomorrow, and then I think Monday too. So
Okay.
I have things I got to do in between though. Oh, I got so much to do. I'm going to a jail. Like as soon as we get off this, I'm going to a jail. So I'm hanging out in the jail this afternoon.
Good times. That's good
Excellent.
All
times.
right,
That's
hey, man,
cool.
that's where all the
That's
cool
awesome.
people are. I'll tell you what.
I know,
you want
man.
to- Let me take you to the jail.
Listen, I'm telling you, when I worked in the prison system, the inmates were the least of my worries. Let's just put it that way.
I have
It was great. I loved
absolute-
working with them,
Totally.
with everybody
totally.
else.
That's right. There's a lot
Yeah.
of lunacy going on, but it's
Yeah.
not.
It's not from them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Well, thank you.
exactly. Yes. Thank you so much, Jack. We will let you get to it. Yeah, we'll see how things pan out Monday with opening statements and with Karen Reed. And we appreciate you coming on to discuss with us.
Absolutely.
I'll be watching. Thank you.
All
Thank
right.
you, Jack. Take care.
Take care, Jack. I might have removed him like way too fast just now. I didn't mean to push the button. Jack, if you're still watching, I'm so sorry. Oh gosh. Okay. Yeah.
That's
Now I
okay.
feel really bad. Like and subscribe, guys. First of all, I want to say I
Mhm.
never thought that I'd be on YouTube saying a phrase like and subscribe because
Yep.
that's what my kids say. I also want to note that my sister just came onto the chat at the
She
end
did.
of this. So thanks for being here, Jill. You're going to
Hi,
have
Jill.
to watch the replay. Thank you guys so much for being here. I appreciate it. I'm going to go email and apologize to Jack now for cutting him off too soon. So we'll
Thank
talk
you
to guys
guys. And
later.
yeah, we'll be letting you know when we're going to be on next.
Yep. Stay tuned. See you later.
All right. Thanks,
All right,
guys.
bye.